I remember moments like this because they don't announce themselves as historic. They arrive quietly, a plane, a handcuff, a single decision made in Washington, and suddenly the rules everyone claimed to live by are no longer clear. And the world didn't just watch, it trembled. The United States says it removed an illegitimate leader. Many countries agree, and yet in the same breath, those governments are alarmed not by who was taken, but how it was done. Because this was not just about Nicolas Maduro. It was about whether power now speaks louder than law, whether the UN Charter still restrains the strong or merely comforts the weak, whether America's closest allies still believe the system they helped build can survive its own contradictions. If you care about global order, about Ukraine, about sovereignty, about what rules actually mean in 2025, stay with me. Because what happened in Venezuela may look isolated, but it isn't. It is the opening crack in something much larger and far more dangerous. And to understand why, we have to slow down and ask what this moment really represents. The seizure of Nicolas Maduro has thrown a spotlight on a profound contradiction. On one hand, Maduro is widely seen as illegitimate, repressive, and complicit in criminal networks. On the other, the method of his removal, a unilateral military operation, challenges the very rules designed to keep nations accountable to one another. Across the globe, allies and adversaries alike are asking the same question. Can the strongest nation in the world act without consequence? France and Denmark condemned the action for violating international law. Russia accused the US of neocolonialism. China called it bullying. Meanwhile, other European states hesitated, torn between principle and pragmatism, wary of angering a powerful ally. This tension exposes the fragile line between law and power, and between diplomatic norms and realpolitik. It is not just about Maduro or Venezuela. It is a test of whether international rules still matter when a superpower decides they don't. And as the world watches, we must ask, what happens when law bends to power, even temporarily? The answer will shape not just the Americas, but the future of global order. To understand why this moment matters, we must trace the roots of Venezuela's crisis and the long shadow of US influence in the region. For decades, Venezuela was seen as a key energy partner, its vast oil reserves a cornerstone of global markets. China invested heavily, building alliances that spanned 600 agreements, projecting influence deep into South America. Meanwhile, the US watched cautiously, balancing diplomacy, sanctions, and covert pressure, always wary of instability on its southern doorstep. The rise of Nicolas Maduro marked a turning point. His government, accused of repression and corruption, strained both domestic trust and international patience. Yet, even as the world condemned his actions, the framework of international law remained the guiding principle for response until last week. The US seizure of Maduro shattered that expectation, highlighting a system where power can override legal norms in a matter of hours. This is not an isolated event. It is a moment shaped by decades of geopolitics, by competing visions of sovereignty, and by the fragility of international order when national interest trumps principle. And as we move forward, we must examine the first flashpoint, the immediate crisis unleashed by this bold act. The world reacted almost instantly. Allies and adversaries alike were thrown into shock. France and Denmark condemned the operation as a violation of international law. Russia accused the US of neocolonialism. China called it bullying. Even some European nations, torn between principle and pragmatism, hesitated to take a stance, wary of angering Washington. The seizure of Maduro was not just a tactical maneuver. It was a symbolic earthquake, exposing the tension between law and power, principle and expedience. For the US, it was framed as a law enforcement operation, a necessary step to prevent Venezuela from becoming a hub for malign actors. For the rest of the world, it looked like a superpower rewriting the rules on the fly, a warning that sovereignty may be negotiable when the strongest hand is on the table. The reaction was immediate, widespread, and heated, a reminder that even a single raid can ripple across continents. If you're wondering how such an operation could shake the foundations of international order, stay with me. Because the real story lies beneath the surface, in the hidden mechanisms that allowed this bold move to happen. Beneath the headlines, there is a system at work, one that makes such audacious acts possible. It is the intersection of power, influence, and strategic dependency. The US does not act in a vacuum. European nations rely on Washington for security, particularly in the context of Ukraine. Developing nations weigh decades of Western military interventions against their own experiences of sovereignty violations. All of this creates a delicate web where principle often bends to expedience. In Venezuela, the system reveals itself clearly. Maduro's regime had long been isolated, yet shielded by alliances with China and other sympathetic states. Sanctions and diplomacy were insufficient to shift the balance. The US, seeing an opportunity to assert control over critical resources and preempt strategic threats, calculated that a unilateral action would succeed precisely because the international system is fragile, fragmented, and unevenly enforced. This is the hidden mechanism, a world where rules exist, but power decides when they matter, where legality is respected only when convenient, and where alliances can simultaneously protect and constrain action, creating paradoxes that the strongest can exploit. Understanding this system is essential because the next shock, the second crisis, will reveal just how fast the consequences can spiral. The consequences hit again faster, wider, and more intense. News of the raid spread across diplomatic channels and social media, sparking debates from New York to Beijing. European capitals scrambled to respond. Spain, France, and Denmark voiced outrage. The UK and Greece offered only cautious statements. Meanwhile, Russia and China amplified their condemnation, portraying the US as a lawless hegemon. For ordinary citizens watching from afar, it was dizzying. A single operation had suddenly destabilized centuries of international norms. The notion that sovereignty is inviolable, that powerful nations cannot act unchecked, suddenly felt fragile, even performative. The US insisted this was an enforcement action necessary to prevent Venezuela from becoming a hub for criminal and terrorist networks. Yet the global reaction exposed a deep truth. Powerful actions ripple in unpredictable ways, and even calculated maneuvers create crises that no state can fully control. This second wave of shock underscores a critical point. The world is watching not just what is done, but what it says about the rules that govern us all. And as these tensions mount, the question becomes personal. How does this affect the lives of the people who live under the shadow of these superpower decisions? For the people of Venezuela, these headlines are not abstract debates. They are the walls closing in, the uncertainty that shapes daily life. Families wake to news of a leader seized, unsure what comes next. Markets wobble, essential goods vanish, and the shadows of fear creep into neighborhoods already strained by years of repression. You can feel it in the stories of citizens who must navigate a country where power is suddenly unpredictable, where foreign powers decide their fate from thousands of miles away, where promises of democracy clash with the reality of force. And this is where the emotional truth hits hardest. Every political maneuver, every international calculation translates into human consequences. Lives are disrupted, futures are paused, trust is shattered. If you care about justice, about fairness, about the dignity of ordinary people caught in extraordinary events, ask yourself, how long can a system survive when the strong bend the rules and the weak bear the cost? The human stakes are real, and yet the story does not end here, because the consequences spread beyond borders, shaping not just one nation, but the world. The reverberations of Venezuela's crisis extend far beyond its borders. Allies and adversaries alike are forced to reassess strategy, alliances, and credibility. Europe wrestles with its own contradictions. How can nations champion international law while relying on a superpower that bends it at will? Developing countries watch closely, citing the raid as yet another example of Western double standards. Energy markets shudder. China, with deep investments and strategic ties, recalculates its influence across South America. Russia uses the moment to highlight US unilateralism, reinforcing narratives of neocolonial ambition. Even Latin American neighbors face uncertainty, worried that sovereignty can no longer guarantee security. Diplomacy now moves under tension, with every conversation, every treaty, every negotiation shadowed by a single question: if one nation can act unchecked, what protects the rest? And as global powers reposition, the fragile lattice of international order quivers. The crisis in Venezuela becomes a prism, revealing how deeply interconnected modern geopolitics are and how quickly localized actions can cascade into a worldwide challenge. The next question looms large. What future scenarios await if these patterns continue unchecked? Looking ahead, the world faces three possible paths. The first is cautious optimism. European and regional powers may take greater responsibility for their own security, learning from the fragility exposed by this crisis. A coalition could emerge that balances power with principle, enforcing rules while respecting sovereignty. In this scenario, the seizure of Maduro becomes a wake-up call, a lesson in the importance of law, diplomacy, and multilateral action. The second middling scenario is a continuation of tension without resolution. Nations adapt, but principles bend. Sovereignty becomes negotiable when convenient, and global norms erode slowly, quietly, leaving a world where power dictates law in practice, if not in principle. Allies grow wary, adversaries emboldened, and uncertainty lingers in energy markets, trade, and diplomacy. The third darkest scenario is systemic instability. Unilateral actions by powerful states accelerate. International law is ignored. Regional conflicts flare, alliances fracture, and the world enters a period where trust is scarce, rules are optional, and crises cascade uncontrollably. Each path is shaped by choices made today. How nations respond, how leaders weigh principle against pragmatism, and how citizens demand accountability. These will determine whether the opening crack becomes a chasm. And with this in mind, we turn to the final reflection: what this means for insight, responsibility, and action. The seizure of Nicolas Maduro is more than a single event. It is a mirror reflecting the fragility of international law, the power of unilateral action, and the contradictions at the heart of global order. We have seen how a single operation can ripple across continents, testing alliances, shaking markets, and casting doubt on the principles that were supposed to govern nations. We have witnessed the human cost, the uncertainty, and the fear that ordinary people endure when power acts unchecked. And now, the choice is ours, collectively and individually. Do we accept a world where rules are optional, where strength dictates law, and where trust becomes a rare commodity? Or do we demand accountability, uphold principles, and build systems resilient enough to withstand the temptations of unchecked power? For you watching, this is more than news. It is a lesson in vigilance, responsibility, and awareness. The cracks we observe today may shape tomorrow's world, for better or worse. Stay informed, stay critical, and never forget, the story of Venezuela is a story of us all. And the next moment of global reckoning may already be on the horizon.